She was 21, moving through an ordinary evening that felt like any other, her mind split between responsibilities and quiet hopes she rarely allowed herself to voice. The restaurant lights reflected faintly in the windshield as she pulled into the parking lot, arriving early as she always did, the habit of someone who took pride in reliability even when life had forced her onto a path she never intended to walk. Her name was Savannah Gold, and the life she had imagined for herself had already been rewritten once before, traded away willingly when her mother fell gravely ill. Where there had once been dreams of art school and independence, there was now a routine defined by work shifts, hospital visits, and the quiet strength it took to hold a family together while everything seemed to be unraveling. She didn't complain about it, not out loud, not to anyone. To most people, she was the kind, attentive waitress who remembered orders without writing them down and smiled even on the longest nights. To her family, she was something more essential, a steady presence, a source of comfort, someone who had chosen love over ambition without hesitation. That night, though, something subtle shifted, something that would fracture the rhythm of her life and ripple outward into something far darker than anyone could have imagined. She parked her car just across from the restaurant, a familiar spot that allowed her a short walk to the entrance. The air was still, the kind of quiet that settles just before dusk gives way to night. She turned off the engine, gathered herself, and stepped out, unaware that within minutes, everything would change. There was someone waiting, someone she recognized, someone she had trusted enough to approach without fear. Their conversation began like many others had before, brief and seemingly controlled. But beneath the surface there was tension, unresolved conflict, something unfinished. What exactly was said in those first moments would never be fully known, but what followed would later be pieced together through fragments of evidence and the chilling clarity of hindsight. She got into his car, whether it was out of obligation, pressure, or an attempt to resolve something lingering between them. No one could say for certain. What was known, however, was that she did not leave that car the way she entered it. Inside, something escalated. Voices rose, movement became forceful, and what began as an interaction quickly spiraled into violence. Outside, the world remained unaware, the restaurant continuing its evening service, customers arriving and leaving, coworkers moving through their shifts without realizing that just a short distance away, a tragedy was unfolding. Time passed minutes that stretched into something irreversible. At some point, the man stepped out of the vehicle, deliberately damaging her car, creating the illusion that it had been disabled, as though to suggest she had left on her own or been forced to abandon it. Then he returned to his car, where the struggle had already reached its devastating conclusion. When he drove away, she was still inside, and she would never be seen alive again. Back at home, her absence began to register almost immediately. She was not someone who missed work without notice, not someone who disappeared without explanation. When her manager realized she had not arrived, concern turned into action, and soon her family was contacted. The explanation that followed messages sent from her phone, claiming she had chosen to leave with someone, felt wrong from the beginning. The tone was off, the phrasing unnatural, lacking the warmth and clarity that defined her usual way of communicating. It didn't sound like her, it didn't feel like her, and more importantly, it didn't align with the person they knew. A young woman who had sacrificed her own future to stay by her mother's side would not suddenly abandon everything without a word. Driven by instinct and fear, her family went to the restaurant themselves. What they found only deepened the unease. Her car was there, parked exactly where it should have been, but inside it were all the things she would never leave behind voluntarily. Her purse, her identification, her money. The small details became overwhelming in their significance. The flat tire, the absence of her phone, the stillness of a vehicle that should have been just one step in her routine, not the end point of it. When they contacted the police, they expected urgency, immediate action, a recognition that something was deeply wrong. Instead, they were met with hesitation, the kind that often accompanies missing person cases in their earliest hours. There were procedures, timelines, assumptions that needed to be followed. From the outside, it felt like delay. From within the system, it was protocol. But for a family already certain that this was not a voluntary disappearance, every passing moment felt like a loss. As the hours turned into a day, investigators began speaking with those who knew her friends, co-workers, anyone who might provide insight into her last known movements. Initially, nothing pointed clearly toward foul play. There were no immediate signs of a struggle at the scene, no witnesses stepping forward with definitive accounts. But then came the footage. A camera positioned at a distance, capturing a wider view than the one directly overlooking the parking space, revealed something critical. It showed her stepping out of her car, then approaching another vehicle. It showed her getting inside. And though the footage alone did not tell the full story, it contradicted the narrative suggested by the text messages. She had not left freely. She had not driven away. She had entered someone else's car. And from that moment forward, her path diverged into something far more dangerous. As investigators reviewed additional footage, the situation became even more troubling. There were signs of a struggle, movements that suggested resistance rather than cooperation. The man exited the car at one point, damaging her tire before returning inside. The vehicle itself shifted, rocked in a way that indicated something violent was taking place. And when it finally left the scene, there was no indication that she had exited. That realization changed everything. The case was no longer a missing person scenario, it was something far more serious. The next question became the most urgent one. Who was the man in that car? The answer, when it came, was both unexpected and deeply unsettling. The vehicle belonged to someone she knew, someone connected to her workplace, someone who had already spoken to investigators and denied any involvement. That contradiction set the stage for what would follow: a slow unraveling of lies, inconsistencies, and ultimately, the truth. When he was brought in for questioning again, he attempted to reshape his story, admitting partial truths while concealing the most critical details. He spoke of a relationship, one that had been hidden due to workplace rules and personal complications. He framed their interaction as brief, controlled, ending with her leaving his car and getting into another vehicle. It was a calculated narrative, one designed to distance himself from responsibility while acknowledging just enough to explain away the evidence. But the investigators already knew more than he realized. They had seen the footage. They knew she had not left. And as the questioning continued, the gaps in his story became impossible to ignore. His explanations grew strained, his confidence began to falter, and the pressure of the situation started to break through the version of events he had constructed. Physical evidence added to the suspicion marks on his body that did not align with his explanations, signs of a recent struggle that contradicted his claims. Each detail, taken alone, might have been dismissed. Together, they formed a pattern that pointed toward a single conclusion. He was lying. And more importantly, he knew exactly what had happened to her. What followed was a gradual shift in tone, a transition from denial to partial admission, from carefully constructed lies to fragments of truth slipping through under pressure. At first, he resisted, repeating his claims, deflecting questions, attempting to maintain control. But as the interrogation continued, that control eroded. The reality of the situation closed in around him, leaving fewer and fewer places to hide. Eventually, he acknowledged what investigators already suspected: that something had happened inside the car, that the situation had escalated beyond his control. And in that moment, the focus shifted from finding her alive to understanding what had been done and where she had been taken. The answer, when it came, was devastating. What he revealed next did not come all at once, but in fragments, pieces of a reality he had tried to bury beneath denial and misdirection. And as those pieces came together, they painted a picture that was as tragic as it was irreversible, because by the time he admitted that she was no longer alive, the investigation had already shifted from hope to recovery, from searching for a missing young woman to uncovering the truth behind a life that had been taken far too soon. and the weight of that realization settled heavily over everyone involved, especially the investigators who now had to follow his directions to a place he described with unsettling calm, a location removed from the busy streets and familiar surroundings where she had last been seen, a place where he believed his actions would remain hidden. And as officers made their way there, the atmosphere grew tense with anticipation and dread, because even without seeing what lay ahead, they already understood what they were likely to find. And when they arrived at the pond he had mentioned, the stillness of the water contrasted sharply with the violence that had brought them there, creating a moment that felt suspended between confirmation and disbelief, until the search began and the truth could no longer be avoided, because beneath that quiet surface, they discovered what remained of Savannah, her body having been deliberately burned in an attempt to erase evidence, to obscure the details of what had happened, and to delay identification. But even in that condition, it was enough to bring the search to an end and replace uncertainty with a devastating finality. And as the recovery process unfolded, the focus turned toward understanding not only how this had happened, but why. Because in cases like this, the question of motive lingers just as heavily as the act itself. And yet, sometimes the answer is not as complex as people expect. Sometimes it is rooted in impulse, in anger, in the inability to control a situation that spirals beyond reason. And according to his eventual statement, that is exactly what he claimed had occurred. That during their time inside the car, an argument escalated into a physical confrontation, that she fought back, that he responded with force, and that in that moment, something shifted from conflict to fatality, a line crossed that could never be uncrossed. And while he would later attempt to frame his actions as self-defense, the evidence surrounding the case, from the deliberate damage to her vehicle to the attempts at concealment afterward, told a different story, one that suggested not a momentary reaction but a sequence of choices made after the fact, each one distancing him further from any claim of innocence. Because even if the initial altercation had been unplanned, everything that followed demonstrated awareness, intent, and a clear effort to avoid accountability. And as the investigation continued, those details became critical in building the case against him, ensuring that what had happened would not be dismissed as an accident or misunderstanding, but recognized for what it truly was: a violent act, followed by calculated decisions to hide it. And when the case moved into the legal system, the process brought its own challenges. Because despite his earlier confession, he initially chose to plead not guilty, presenting a version of events that attempted to justify his actions, to frame them within a narrative that might reduce his responsibility. But the strength of the evidence, combined with the inconsistencies in his statements, made that position increasingly difficult to maintain, and eventually, faced with the reality of what the trial would likely bring, he accepted a plea agreement, acknowledging his role in her death and avoiding the uncertainties of a full trial. And while that decision brought a measure of closure to the legal proceedings, it did not erase the loss experienced by those who had known and loved Savannah. Because no sentence, no matter how long, could restore what had been taken. And for her family, the outcome was both necessary and insufficient. A resolution that provided answers but could never offer true relief, especially for her mother, who had already been facing her own battle, who had relied on her daughter not only for support but for emotional strength during one of the most difficult periods of her life. And in the aftermath of Savannah's death, that loss became even more profound, compounding the pain of illness with the grief of losing the person who had chosen to stand beside her through it all. And yet, even in the face of that overwhelming hardship, she continued to speak about her daughter, to remember her, not for the way her life ended, but for the way she had lived, emphasizing her kindness, her dedication, and the sacrifices she had made for the people she loved. Because those qualities defined her far more than the circumstances of her death ever could. And as time passed, the case remained a reminder of how quickly ordinary moments can turn into irreversible tragedies, how trust can be misplaced, and how the consequences of a single encounter can extend far beyond what anyone anticipates. leaving behind questions that linger even after the facts have been established. Questions about what might have been different if certain choices had changed, if certain signs had been recognized earlier, if intervention had come sooner. But those questions, while natural, rarely lead to satisfying answers, because the reality is that events unfold in ways that cannot be undone, and all that remains is the effort to understand them, to learn from them, and to ensure that the memory of the person at the center of it all is not overshadowed by the darkness of what happened. And, in Savannah's case, that means remembering a young woman who put her family first, who gave up opportunities for the sake of someone she loved, who built connections with the people around her through kindness and reliability, and who, on what should have been just another day, found herself in a situation that spiraled beyond her control, taken not by chance alone, but by the actions of someone who chose violence over restraint. And as the years continue to pass, her story remains one that resonates not only because of its tragedy, but because of its humanity. Because it reflects the vulnerabilities that exist in everyday life, the moments where trust intersects with risk, and the ways in which ordinary routines can be disrupted in an instant. And while the legal case may be closed, the impact of what happened continues to ripple outward, carried by those who remember her, by those who hear her story, and by the understanding that behind every case like this is a person whose life extended far beyond the headlines, far beyond the investigation. A life filled with intentions, relationships, and meaning, all of which deserve to be recognized and remembered, even in the face of such a devastating ending.